aquí estamos en otro programa de Pensadores Contemporáneos. Un gusto, un honor contar con su atención. Estamos en la sala Nezahualcóyotl, un hermoso lugar, patrimonio de la UNAM y la humanidad. Y tenemos un invitado de lujo, un gran honor recibir aquí a David Harvey. Welcome, David, to the UNAM.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here with us.
Well, my pleasure.
David Harvey, como bien conoce, es de los grandes pensadores contemporáneos. Él es geógrafo, aunque también da clases en la Facultad de Antropología en la City University de Nueva York. Es autor de más de una docena de libros. Yo recuerdo en el posgrado leyendo uno de sus libros clásicos, The Condition of Postmodernity, que era su primera gran obra maestra. Pero en las últimas décadas ha estado escribiendo pues, muchas cosas. Por ejemplo, este gran libro también muy importante sobre la historia del neoliberalismo. Otro libro reciente sobre las ciudades rebeldes. Es experto también en la cuestión urbana, del desarrollo urbano y de los espacios urbanos. Y además es un crítico de izquierda, marxista, que tiene un pensamiento muy creativo sobre ese tema. Así que, so let's start. Well, I'll shift to English, of course, because David understands some Spanish, but I think you prefer to speak in English.
Yes.
So, we're in a very complex time in the world these days. And Mexico is in a strategic position, perhaps. I like to imagine, we're just on borders with the United States. We've just had an important election in which we've defeated neoliberalism, or at least that's what we say.
No, you haven't, but that's okay. That's okay.
Is it possible to defeat neoliberalism in one country, or does this have to be a global struggle?
Well, two things. Revolutions don't occur overnight anymore. They are long drawn-out processes. And you're at the beginning, and I've actually been struggling with this for some time, and you're now on another step in a long drawn-out process. So I think irrespective of what's going on in the rest of the world, you would have an internal dynamic that would take a lot of time to work through. People's ideas have to change, their practices have to change, and the like. The other problem, of course, is that to get out of the neoliberal trap is to get out of a world which is rather hostile, I think. But at the same time, I think it's vulnerable. And so I think this election here in Mexico was very significant. For all sorts of reasons. One is that in Mexico you have something called a revolutionary tradition.
Of course.
And no matter how you think of it, we know that revolutionary traditions have a habit of re-emerging in certain kinds of ways. Also, Mexico has had a very special place politically in the neoliberal era. It's never caved in to sort of isolating Cuba. It was, during the 1970s and 1980s, a place of refuge for all sorts of intellectuals of the left from all over Latin America. So it's always been a place of ferment and thinking and the like. And so I think the fact that there has been a move gently towards the left, if I can put it that way,
Sure.
is a very encouraging sign at a moment when the world is in turmoil. And frankly, you look at what's going on in many countries, and it's close to kind of insanity in my view. I mean, the election of somebody like Bolsonaro in Brazil is pretty terrifying, and frankly, I can't imagine the Brazilians are going to put up for very long. So it may be an interim thing. I think the same thing about Donald Trump in the United States. Yeah, he came to power, he has a certain kind of influence, but he's extremely vulnerable, as we see. And I think the fact that the global economy is wobbling a lot these days, and he could sit back and take great credit for the economy when everything was going fine. And now we have a situation which is gradually sort of unraveling. And so I think this is a very key moment. So it's very good that Mexico has got to this point.
So you don't necessarily think there's a global shift towards fascism or neo-fascism? These are more temporary kind of blips in a larger, more profound process.
One of the concepts I use a lot these days is the concept of alienation.
Alienation. Mm-hmm.
And I think we've got alienated populations all over the place. They're alienated from the labor process because meaningful jobs are very hard to find, let alone even jobs being hard to find. People are alienated from conditions of daily life over inadequate housing, inadequate services, the cutting back and the austerity, all of those sorts of things. So you've got alienation in the workplace, you've got alienation in the living space, you've got alienation from the political process, because the feeling is that those parties that were supposed to speak for the common good have not done so. And so there's an abandonment of some traditional left parties. And the left, I think, has to come back to some sort of position where it speaks for the alienated populations and says, the answer is not to vote for some lunatic of the right wing and to blame immigrants and foreigners and all the rest of it and to go sort of nationalist. The answer is not that at all, but there's going to have to be a battle fought on those grounds. Again, I would say this is a very, very significant thing that there are these bright spots in the global economy right now. And I think Mexico right now for me, is one of them. And I'm delighted to be here. And as I said yesterday, actually, I think if you were sensible in Mexico, you would build the wall. You would build the wall to keep American capital out.
And guns, right? Of
yes,
course.
and absolutely. So,
but wouldn't that create, a massive economic crisis?
Yes,
and
yes, of course. Yes, of course. But so it is a joke. But nevertheless, I think that the relationship between Mexico and the United States is going to be a very interesting field over the next few years.
And you think there's a need and a possibility for Mexico to become increasingly independent of the United States, if not building a law delinking,
right.
But that would be your vision of how Mexico could perhaps strengthen itself in the global economy.
I'm not sure that would be the best way to think of it.
Okay.
This is my geographer view of the world.
Of course.
Proximity is actually terribly important. And Mexico, to some degree, has been in competition with China over the U.S. market. And I think the fact that the United States and the government is moving to sort of be rather hostile towards the China trade, and the fact that Mexico is closer to the American market across the border, that actually this is a moment where Mexico should be strengthening its economic ties and its economic penetration of the U.S. market, and I think there are some positive ways to go there. So I think again, we shouldn't fall into the trap that because relations with Trump are likely to be hostile, that we should abandon what seems to me to be an important economic strategy, which is strengthening some of the links with
That's
the U.S.
fascinating
economy.
to say that, because at least within the discussion on the Mexican left over the last 20, 30 years, there was originally very strong opposition to NAFTA, TLC, Tratado de Libre Comercio.
Yes, right.
Because this was going to create, which happened, an excessive dependency of the Mexican economy on the United States. There's a saying here that when Wall Street gets a cold, we fall deathly ill, right? And when they sneeze, we get seriously sick. And so, and this has actually happened. And the left was actually right in many ways. But now that this has already happened, all of a sudden, at least López Obrador and many of his economic advisors are now actually, I don't know if pro-NAFTA, but looking to go beyond it and through it instead of going back. And it seems like you agree with that general strategy. Globalization is there. We need to confront it, deal with it. isolationism is no longer an option, or how would you put it?
No, I think that's right, but I think that the repositioning of the U.S. in relationship to global trade patterns is something which is actually was in motion before Trump started to push around with it, and so I think that Mexico's position, again, in the global trade network can be improved, and I think that any kind of ideological, oh, we don't want to go there at all, is probably is not the right way to go. How you go and what you cultivate, I mean, I'd have to leave it to people who know more about it than I do, but I mean, I think, for example, agricultural produce here from Mexico into the United States has now become very important, I think, for the Mexican economy. I think when NAFTA first came through, you were in effect hit by all Californian agribusiness kind of products, and it destroyed a lot of your corn and other things. And
massive migration. The reason for the migration is NAFTA in many ways. Yeah.
But now you've done it, and now that's happened, so you're not going to turn that around and go back to what was going on before. So now the question is, how can you actually improve your economy by strategic invasions of the U.S. market?
Good. Now, neoliberalism is a huge concept, and you've participated very actively with your book and in general conferences and articles to the discussion about this concept. From the conservative academia intellectual sphere, people say that neoliberalism is not a term which has actually real content to it. It's just an ideological way in which people on the left disqualify free markets and are just trying to cover up a hidden sort of radical Marxist agenda. You know, they disqualify the term neoliberalism itself. Now you defend, as far as I can tell from reading you, a more specific historical, sociological, geographic definition of neoliberalism. How would you summarize it for our audience?
I've always argued that the neoliberal turn of the 1970s was a strategic project on the part of the large corporations and of the wealthy ruling class of that time to preserve their wealth and power, which in the early 1970s was under threat. It was under threat politically because labor unions were strong, political parties of the left were coming to power in Europe. The '68 generation was very strongly opposed to corporate power. The students in Santa Barbara buried a Chevy in the sand and burned down a Bank of America building. Things like that were going on. Anti-corporate legislation was being passed in Congress. During these years, things like the Environmental Protection Agency, Consumer Protection, Occupational Safety and Health were all being sort of passed by Congress. And Nixon made a very interesting kind of comment when he signed this into law, saying, well, I guess we're all Keynesians now. Very interesting kind of comment. So
accepting his defeat in some way, ideological defeat.
Yes, accepting the defeat, and I think that suddenly the ultra rich and the corporate heads saw that this was not, you know, they were not going to go anywhere with this. So that's when they mounted this counterattack, in which groups like the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce started to sort of get together and say, we need a class project to deal with this onslaught, which is an anti-capitalist onslaught. And they actually strategically looked, and it was very interesting because they kind of said, you know, the universities are essentially centers of left-wing kind of sentiment and student movement. So we're not going to touch the universities. What we're going to do is we're going to surround the universities with these think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the National Bureau of Economic Research, Manhattan Institute, and we're going to produce a vast amount of information. We're going to gather the press, and we're going to start to actually then work through to develop a set of ruling ideas. And this is a very simple formula, but a ruling class at some point or other needs a set of ruling ideas to legitimize and support itself. And now, I don't think actually the Business Roundtable sat down and read Hayek and read Friedman and all of those other people. I think they kind of basically looked around and said, what is it that supports our position?
It wasn't actually a theoretical academic initiative.
It was a class initiative. It was a class initiative. But it found to hand there was this kind of long-standing project of Hayek and all the rest of it to kind of say, look, the defense of individual freedom depends upon individual property rights, free markets, and free trade. And that was their central kind of idea. So that central idea then was picked up by the Business Roundtable and all the rest of it. And they said, okay, this is what we're going to run with. And I think it's very interesting that one of the foundational texts of this was, of course, Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose. And he did a very clever thing. There was a series on the public broadcasting by Galbraith, Kenneth Galbraith, which was a kind of, in a sense, an understanding of the economy from the Keynesian perspective. And Milton Friedman demanded free time, so he got his series about Free to Choose on PBS. And so this was, if you like, the ruling ideas which connected. And then that group started to say, well, how are we going to work politically? And this is where two things happened. One thing was they started to pour money into elections. They realized that they needed to buy elections. And there were a whole series of Supreme Court cases about money in elections, and the Supreme Court decided that the spending of money on elections was guaranteed under free speech. Free speech, so that the dollar spoke, as it were, and the dollar needed to have a way to speak. So actually, from this time on, the money corruption of the electoral process really set in big time. The second thing was they needed a political base in Congress. And of course, they moved and started to dominate the Republican Party. They needed a mass base, and that's when they started to actually animate the Christian evangelical base. So in the 1970s, all of this went on, and it was a fairly systematic kind of process. So by the time you get into the 1980s,
you get Ronald Reagan as the result.
You get Ronald Reagan, and similar things were going on in Britain at the time. So you get Ronald Reagan, you get Margaret Thatcher, who are the sort of two iconic figures.
Of course, but they're results of a deeper process before. They're not the beginnings.
Exactly. And of course you have Pinochet,
right,
in Chile, which was one of the first kind of real out and out sort of neoliberal government. I mean, Pinochet came to power. Initially it was a troika, but he got rid of the other two, and the other two were a bit Keynesian, and Pinochet kind of said, what are we going to do about the economy? But the Catholic University there had an economics department where the economists had all been trained by Milton Friedman in Chicago. And so they called in the Chicago boys, which was not actually from Chicago. They were the Chicago trained economists in Chile, to restructure the economy along these free market kinds of lines. And so that's
I was going to say, because one thing is the correlation of forces, ideological class power in the United States, but when you bring neoliberalism to Latin America and the Third World, you create death. And war and destruction, and it's the Central America as well. We below the Rio Grande, the ones who suffer directly the effects of this ideological struggle in the North, right?
Yes, and I think this, by the way, is a very important thing to remember. That while neoliberalism, in a sense, became dominant in, say, the United States and Britain through democratic kind of processes of the sort I've described, in many parts of the world is imposed by violence. And in some parts of the world it was economic violence, because in 1982 all of the Keynesians were thrown out of the International Monetary Fund. And we got
what year?
1982.
82.
And all of the monetarists came in, and of course that was the year of the Mexican debt crisis.
Exactly.
And so this was then going to be treated in a neoliberal way, not in a Keynesian kind of way, which is austerity became and you lost income and well-being in Mexico as a result of the IMF adjustment. So. In Chile, it was done by military force. In Mexico, it was done through the force and power of the international financial institutions.
Along with the authoritarian political system, which facilitated this approach.
Absolutely.
So what you're saying is that neoliberalism is not really, I mean, because here some people think of neoliberalism as being, technocratic free market ideology,
Yes,
right? But what you're saying is it's not just a group of ideas, but it's actually a class project of a, a coalition of political and economic power using this ideology to capture a larger part of the market and of capital. But we shouldn't only be debating ideologically or theoretically, but also historically and socially.
But there's something interesting here. Once the ruling class has actually created the ruling ideas and the ruling ideas become dominant, then the ruling class doesn't have to act like the ruling class anymore, because it lets the ruling ideas and the technocratic side of it just simply take over. So the technocratic side of, for example, the International Monetary Fund, I don't think they think of themselves as neoliberals in the class sense at all. Right? They see themselves purely as technocrats who are enforcing a logic of an economic system which is taken for granted. And so you can then look at something like what happened in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the wall. And you have all of those economies like Romania and Bulgaria and so on, and they kind of say, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? They haven't got a ruling class because this whole thing is kind of falling apart. But the IMF comes in with all of its, and the European Central Bank and they all come in and they're technocratic and say, here is what you do.
Let's create a ruling class, right?
So actually in Russia, of course, they did create a ruling class. I mean, they came in and they said, okay, free markets, free trade, and what did they get? They got oligarchs, owning everything. And so then Putin's been trying to sort of manage the oligarchs ever since. So I think, but there's something kind of weird about this, which is really contradictory. I mean, there's this foundational text by Milton Friedman. It says, free to choose, free to choose, free to choose. And then you get to Margaret Thatcher and she says, there is no alternative. There is no alternative. You have to do this. You have to do this. And you get the authoritarianism of the International Monetary Fund that goes to Mexico and says, okay, you've got a debt problem, we'll get you out of the debt problem, but you've got to do this, this, and this, and this, free your labor markets, liberalize your, get rid of the ejidos, and, all those kinds of things. So it's a very interesting kind of connection between authoritarianism on the one hand and this ideology of free to choose. Now, the legitimacy of neoliberalism in many ways had a lot to do with freedom to choose, because I think the idea of freedom to choose was terribly important to the '68 generation of students and all the rest of it. Okay, the trouble was those students also believed in something called social justice, and I think what the corporate power decided in the 1970s was to say, okay, we'll give them freedom to choose, but it's going to be freedom to choose through the market. They should forget the social justice, because we want to get more and more of that wealth for ourselves. And in effect, this is what the neoliberal era has been about.
Personal liberation, which we still live today.
Yes, absolutely.
Social networks and social networks. They also have a liberating potential revolutionary aspect to them, but they also have this aspect of, personal, individualistic expression and liberation without actually organizing and constructing collective solutions.
But what's fascinating to me is to look at the history of innovation during this period. Innovation has again and again started off as something which is about individual liberation and free expression and all the rest of it. Look at the internet. In the early stages of the internet, it was a utopian thing of individual liberty, freedom, peer-to-peer computing, all these sorts of things. Look what it's evolved into. Monopoly power. Huge, huge monopoly power.
Google, Facebook, Twitter, right?
And huge wealth, sort of accumulation through this process. So again and again through the neoliberal era, you start with the individual liberty and you end up with authoritarian monopoly power. And that is actually the practice of what the neoliberal era has been about. But the legitimacy, again and again, comes from the appeal to individual freedom and liberty. And I think that in some ways that worked up until, say, the 1990s in particular. And after the 1990s, some questions started to be raised. So the first big questioning was the sort of attack upon globalization in the Seattle meetings.
Or from the Zapatistas, even before,
yes,
1994.
Right. So you start to get some kind of saying that this whole kind of neoliberal thing was a fraud. In Latin America, by and large, it was recognized as a fraud before almost anywhere else in the world.
The whole, a massive political response in South America.
Absolutely. And that's, again, I think a point where what was going on here and in Latin America more generally was in the lead in terms of creating an oppositional understanding and exposing the fraudulence of the neoliberal model. But of course, by the time you get into the 1990s, the hegemony, if you want to call it, the dominance of the neoliberal way of thinking had become very, very, very significant. And I always kind of think with people like Clinton and Blair, they could have been just like Nixon. They could have sat down and said, but we're all neoliberals now.
Exactly.
And they never said it, but in fact they could have said it because actually they were the ones who absolutely instituted the
institutionalized and
systematized. It was called the Washington Consensus in the 1990s.
And calling it all the way the third way or social democracy.
Yes. Or, you know? And the international institutions like the World Trade Organization, all of that, which was a kind of institutionalization of the ruling ideas, and then you had to get into the World Trade Organization in order to trade, which meant that you had to accept the ruling ideas, which posed very interesting questions for a country like China, which of course is coming with a Marxist kind of communist party background, and it's trying to compete in the world market. And basically it's been told, if you want to get into the world market and you want to become the production center of the world's workshop, as it were, then you've got to obey the neoliberal rules. Right. So China has to go part neoliberal.
Because they also defend, national technology and economic sovereignty in a strong way as well.
Yes, no, absolutely. And one of the things that the Chinese recognized was the nature of this trap, that the WTO, by insisting on certain kinds of things, the Chinese kind of said basically, we'll try to obey WTO rules, but I think they have no actual real intent of doing so, particularly when it comes to free capital flow.
Exactly.
And they believe in free trade and all the rest of it, and commodities and services, but not in free trade of capital, not the free movement of capital. And so China has protected itself, as it were, from the worst of the neoliberal order. Because it saw what happened in Southeast Asia in 1997-98 when all of those countries were essentially forced into bankruptcy. Then the big kind of guns moved in and bought up all of this stuff for almost nothing, and they waited for the recovery and then made like bandits afterwards. So there's a lot of this going on within the neoliberal history.
But the neoliberal framework is starting to collapse. Well, at some level, there's signs. I mean, even Trump and Bolsonaro are, one could say, examples of the collapse of this ideology. This class project is now being forced to be more transparent about what it is all about. And the more classic neoliberal politicians of today, like Macri or Macron, right?
Yes,
I think two other are the ones who are sort of the pure neoliberals.
Yes.
Have only lasted about 6 months before having the legitimacy totally collapsed.
Yes.
I mean, so there is a problem of legitimacy of this project, and then you have Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, López Obrador. Portugal is an interesting case as well.
Right.
So we're living exciting times. Or am I just imagining things?
No. But I think it's, when you say neoliberalism has collapsed, actually, if you look at all the data and say what's happened to class inequality since 2007, 2008, there's been a massive increase in class inequality.
Inequality, right.
Yes. And if that was the objective of the neoliberal project from the very beginning, that objective has not gone away. It's been very successful.
Of course.
And there is this phrase about you never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think 2007, 2008, at a certain point, some of the rich got burned. They were on the wrong side of the deal, as it were. But for most of them, they've come out of the crisis extremely well. So if you kind of say, to what degree there's been any kind of gains from productivity since 2007, 2008, all of those gains have gone to the top 10% and mainly concentrated in the top 0.1%. So, and then there's public policies which have contributed to this. Like the central banks engage in something called quantitative easing, which basically is just printing money.
Right.
And then the money goes out, and then where does it go? Well, it goes into the stock market. And so the stock prices go up. And who owns stocks? Well, of course, the top 1%. So there's a lot of that. The mass of the population has not benefited at all, and in fact has suffered a great deal from the crisis of 2007, 2008. The result of this is that what has collapsed about neoliberalism is not the economic project, not the political project. What's collapsed is its legitimacy.
Its legitimacy, exactly.
And its legitimacy has really fallen apart, although there's a tremendous, absolutely tremendous kind of attempt to retain its legitimacy. I mean, I'm astonished that the whole profession of economics, for example, has not found another path other than some variety of neoliberal monetary kind of theory, and they still...
No soul searching at all, at least in the United States. I think probably in Europe there's a little bit more,
there's
Latin America.
There's a little bit more, but that is then just kind of, in a sense, well, maybe we should revert to some sort of Keynesianism. So it's a kind of... And this is a bit astonishing, because the 1930s, big kind of thing, big revolution in economic thinking, which just produced Keynes. 1970s, real big problem. Big revolution in thinking, one I didn't like, but on the other hand, but it was a real...
Changing the coordinates.
Yes, changing everything. Big crisis, 2007, 2008, what comes out? Nothing.
Piketty, right?
Yes,
is what we have. Does that
description? Well, that's just a description of the rising inequalities that exist. And it's very helpful, I think, to have that description. Doesn't tell you too much about what to do about it. Or
so time is ripe for innovation.
Time is ripe.
In economic policy and ideology.
But there is this fierce ideological battle, which is to try to persuade us that the free market, free trade is still the legitimate way to do it, and privatization is the answer. The answer to global poverty, the answer to global environmental degradation is increasing, sort of liberty and freedom of entrepreneurial action and all the rest of it. So there's a huge ideological battle going on right now, and it's very hard to get very far. Look, for example, at the division within the Labour Party in Britain, which is a very good example of this, because I think Corbyn, McDonnell, and the leadership have understood that they need a completely different economic political model. But the majority of the Labour Party, Blairites, coming out of the 1990s, neoliberal to the core,
are still stuck with the old status quo, right?
And it's only now that Corbyn is beginning to even assert the dominant position within his own political party. So that's within the left.
Right.
That there has not been a sufficient... The same thing is going on within the Democratic Party right now in the United States. We see some of these young people coming out who are kind of...
They haven't quite broken through yet. We still have the Clintonites and the Obamites in control, right?
Exactly. Which leaves everybody with a terrible kind of choice. I mean, I would love to vote Trump out of power, but I don't want a Clinton restoration to do it. Because, and what's more, the American populace will not actually vote for a Clinton restoration.
They're sick of that, right?
No, they're sick of it. They're sick of it. They say basically, we don't want this, and we're not going to have it. So this is a very interesting moment, but this is where the ideological battle is beginning to become very, very significant.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's exciting to think about today. The small actions that we do today might have a big difference.
Right.
Let's move to another topic, which is cities.
Yes.
Right. Because you've been working on that a lot recently. Cities have become a site for ideological, political, class battles. Right. Incredible speculation. It's been a site for also resistance. Your book, most recent book on the topic is called Rebel Cities. What's your perspective on that topic in general?
Well, there's a very interesting kind of comment that was made by one of the governors of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, who kind of says, in the United States, we have a habit of getting out of depressions by building houses and filling them with things. That was a very cute observation, actually. I would also point out that the United States gets into crises by building houses and filling them with things. So there's actually a lot going on in terms of urbanization, which is very much connected to the growing debt economy, the growing problems of using up surplus capital and labor through the building of great mega projects in cities and the like. Because one of the big problems of capital in general right now is how to take the capital surpluses that exist. The IMF uses phrases like the world is awash with surplus liquidity, which says there's so much surplus money going around not knowing where to invest. There's a whole investor class now that kind of says where are profitable places to invest. Right. For instance, I have a mandated pension fund, which is part of that investment class, and so all the pension funds have to invest in debt somewhere, right. And somebody has to use that debt to make something, to do something. Well, it's been harder and harder to find things to do. And so a lot of capital now gets invested in assets. So we see a whole kind of process of land grabbing. Exactly. We see kind of speculation in land markets and housing markets and the like. And we see this as a global phenomenon, and there's a global urban process which vast amounts of money and labor are being absorbed in city building. And you look at the crazy kind of cities they build. I mean, you look at, say, the urbanization of Dubai. Yes, right. Now, you're in a region where there's a mass poverty and real need of kind of massive kind of
investment in housing, right?
in people and housing, you know. And what do? They build some sort of huge kind of skyscraper which has a ski slope in the middle of the desert. What is this for? How is this useful? And we see that going on all around the place. And, you know, I spent some time in China, and China's urbanization is spectacular. But at the same time, you kind of go, is this really meeting the needs of the people? And if so, how and why? And I feel that we're increasingly spending a lot of money building cities for people to invest in. Exactly. Not cities for people to live in. So in New York City, we have one of the biggest booms in construction ever in the history of the city. And it's all about building sort of high-rise condos for the ultra-rich. And we have a huge crisis of affordable housing for the 50% of the population who can't find a decent place to live. And of course, the speculation in land values is forcing people out from the center of the city. Right, there's a direct connection, but it's not just that we're investing in the wrong places, it's that investment in these big buildings actually raises rents and pushes people out and makes the problem worse for them. It makes it, and the quality of life also gets seriously damaged. I mean, I sort of live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And I don't know, there are some kind of friendly bars and things like that. And I've lost count over the last 5 or 6 years how many of them have closed down. And if I know the owner, I say, why are you closing down? And they say the same thing. My lease was up and they doubled the cost, and I just couldn't afford to stay here any longer. And so you end up with a street where there are some, you know, friendly bars and family restaurants and all these kinds of things, and local shoe stores and other things. They're all disappeared. And what do? You get a branch of a bank, you get a drugstore, and you get maybe one of the chain stores, a Starbucks or a Panoply DDN. And you kind of go, what kind of quality of life is it that your neighborhood now is occupied by exactly the same? You know, and at the same time, the transport system is a disaster. Things are just not working. There's no investment in urban, you know, in the qualities of urban life, and you know, and then people get surprised that there are actually uprisings in cities against this deterioration in the qualities of life, and actually a lot of struggles going on right now, which are anti-capitalist struggles, are in fact located in cities. One thinks of Gezi Park in Istanbul. You think of what happened in Brazil in the summer of 2013, when all of a sudden all the cities were out over transport costs and all that spending on the Olympic Games and the World Cup and so on, instead of spending it on social expenditures and so on. So there's a huge kind of level of protest. And increasingly we're seeing radical mayors get elected, like the mayor of Barcelona is very kind of left-wing. But then they have a problem of, well, what do we do? I mean, what will the mayor of Mexico City do?
That's what I was going to say, because what you're saying sounds like a perfect description of what we're going through today in Mexico City. It makes me feel a little better that we're not alone, right? Over the last just 5 or 6 years, there's been an incredible construction boom. The amount of malls that have been constructed in Mexico City is incredible. Creating, that's the new public space, right?
Yes,
These malls, some of them are really fancy, but they're all just malls, right? Huge high rises, incredible speculation, increase in rents, which is benefiting some, but destroying the lives of many others. We have a whole long history of street markets in Mexico City, very similar to Paris, for instance, which are being displaced by Walmarts, of course. And we just had also a political change in Mexico City. This July 1st, we have a new mayor of Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum, who's a colleague here from the UNAM. She's a scientist, environmentalist. What are the central challenges for urban renewal today?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is kind of, I think, I feel a bit besieged with on this kind of question. I mean, let's face it, in terms of academia, I'm in a minority. I don't have a lot of money to build think tanks and all this kind of stuff, whereas the right wing has loads of money to do all this kind of thing. And we need a whole series of very serious think tanks to kind of answer the question, if you come to power in a city like Mexico City or Los Angeles, because we're getting progressive urban governments in the United States now, or Barcelona, then what kinds of things can be done? Right now, if you're a kind of neoliberal mayor, what do? You call McKinsey, and you get a big report which will cost you, I don't know, $10 million consultancy fee, and they will give you the neoliberal answers, and you implement the neoliberal program.
Privatizing water, sewage.
Just go down the line. Well, we need a left version of McKinsey, and then you kind of go and people look at me, and I'm just one kind of isolated individual trying to work on this stuff, and say I should be a kind of like a McKinsey. And you kind of go, I don't know the answer to this. We need
the Harvey Institute.
We need institutes to do this, and I hope that here in Mexico you can be able to build some of those things, and we should have an international network,
of course,
of institutes which are corresponding and saying, well, this is something that really seems to have worked extremely well in this part of the world. Maybe it could work elsewhere. There is an attempt in Barcelona to introduce much more democratic decision making into the city and to democratize things a lot. And I agree with that. But if you don't democratize and there's nothing, if as the famous story was in the 1960s, you're merely putting control of your own slum and you have no resources.
If you just democratize without having increased resources.
And right now, in Britain, for example, there's some radical councils, but the Conservative government has cut all money to municipalities, so they have absolutely no resources to do anything.
Right.
And so at that point you kind of go, all right, well, we've got to find new ways. And then the Conservative government says, well, if you want resources, go into a public-private partnership.
Of course, yeah.
Which
kills democracy, right?
Which kills democracy. And not only that, but I mean, it's pretty evident that what this means is that the public assumes all of the risk and the private takes all of the profits. And so, but
it's
really
worse than privatization,
right?
Straight out, the public-private partnership.
Oh, absolutely worse, because it takes the teeth out of the possibility of the public sector But we've got to put more and more basic forms of urban provision back in the public realm. Now, when I say that, I don't mean necessarily they should be in state control. I think that we have to think of forms of governance and forms of property right, which are outside of the sort of neoliberal norm, and try to sort of set up sort of possibilities of public spaces and things of this kind where certain things can happen. But just to give you just a little minor example, I mean, there are left-wing organizations in New York City. We've on occasion sort of said, well, maybe we should put a lot of these organizations together and we should have a kind of a meeting somewhere. There's no place to have a meeting that doesn't cost a huge amount.
Like an auditorium where you can just
an auditorium or something, and now we can use...
union hall, perhaps?
Well, union halls have basically been privatized, and the unions have sold off a lot of their union halls, So just finding a space
is a struggle itself.
Is a struggle. The only place you can go is some of the churches. Some of the big churches actually, give that space. But there's no permanent space. Now, recently, we have a group of people who've managed to find a space, and it's a good space, and can afford it and pay for it, and open it up to the left. But this takes a lot of money power. But once we've got it, we can start to actually colonize, as it were, the whole city with kind of mini spaces, which are sort of organizing at the city level. So it's partly a political problem of organization. It's also a problem of resources, but it's also a problem of the infrastructures for those organizations and who controls them and who produces them. And so what's happened is that a lot of those infrastructures have been produced in such a way that if, for example, the big developers and bankers and financiers want to have a kind of big meeting, they just get to have a good time together, you know, and they have any space they want in the city. Whereas, when we tried to work with the Right to the City coalition of bringing people together, we couldn't find a space to do it except inside of universities. And democratizing spaces and making spaces so that they're part of a commons and creating an urban commons. These are the kinds of things that need to be done.
I think that in Mexico City, at least, we still have spaces. You yourself, when you gave a talk in the union hall of the telephone workers, which I would imagine they didn't charge a penny for that, and the union halls are still available, and there are lots of cultural centers that belong to the UNAM or to Mexico City, which are still open to the public. I think we need to sort of appreciate. People see that as sort of perhaps even a backwards nostalgia kind of thing, but actually, to the contrary, these are the sites where we can organize and participate. Now, we're running out of time where this conversation is so intense that the time is running by, but I don't want to have this show end without talking to you directly about Marx. Because you have been working on this for a long time. You are a proud Marxist. You're one of our most creative Marxist thinkers of today. Is Marx relevant today? Do we need to read him? What are his lessons?
I find him fascinating, and I constantly go back to Marx for sort of guidance. But I tell you something. If you reduce Marx to a series of propositions about, all history is the history of class struggle, productive forces, and social, if you go into those formulas, you miss the point. One of the great things I learned from Marx is how to analyze a problem, and how to develop conceptual apparatuses that actually get to the guts of a problem, and you penetrate what he called the fetishism and the masks behind which there lie real kinds of processes. So I've learned that from Marx a lot, and I think reading Marx in order to get a method of inquiry and a method of thinking. And this to me has been very important because my primary interest in my life has never been Marx. It's always been urbanization and uneven geographical development and to some degree imperialist forms of domination and geopolitics. I've always wanted that, but I could never find a social scientific frame to work with those issues until I found Marx. Marx gave me a grounding. Now, there are certain things in Marx that don't work. And if they don't work, I kind of go, okay.
You wrote 150 years ago, right?
That's not, I'm not that interested. But he's extremely prescient. I mean, I was going over the notebook version of Volume 3 the other day.
Volume 3 of Capital.
Yeah, Volume 3 of Capital. And Marx is there wrestling with the question of how do we understand what goes on in the world of finance and banking and all this kind of stuff. And he never got to a final conclusion. But what he does is he explores possibilities. And at some point or other he says, you know, if this is really the case, then what's going to happen is that an accumulation of wealth is soon going to appear as an accumulation of debt. That was an astonishing prescient look, and you kind of go, how is the world structured right now? Indebtedness has increased immensely since 1970s. This has been one of the big moves of the neoliberal era. We didn't talk about that aspect, but it's one of the big aspects. Right now, the global debt stands at something like 225% of global GDP.
Wow.
Now, back in 1970 or 1980, when Mexico got
debt crisis,
the ratios were nowhere near that.
Right.
But now it's globally. We need a global IMF disciplining of the whole
of the entire world.
China has absolutely dominated the world's economy. A third of the growth of GDP since 2007, 2008 has been in China. The result is that Chinese debt is now up to around getting close to 300% of GDP.
Of their own GDP?
Yeah, of their own GDP.
Wow.
The only thing about the Chinese debt is it's held in their own currency. It's not dollar debt. I mean,
so
the problem for Mexico was you had dollars, so they've got some control over it. But nevertheless, the indebted problem in China is huge, and they're trying to curb it, and they're trying to do something about it, which is why the Chinese economy right now is slowing down. Now, all these sorts of insights that Marx has about what's the relationship between, you know, what's going on in this financial sphere and what's going on in the realm of production, that those things need to be brought together very, 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 very closely. One of the problems I see in the history of Marxist thinking is there's a lot of emphasis on Volume 1, which of course is about class struggle at the point of production. There's not so much interest in Volume 2, which is about the circulation process, which for me was the foundation of one of my key concepts in the condition of post-modernity, which is where does time-space compression come from? It comes from the circulation of capital because it has to speed up and expand geographically. And Volume 3 of Capital is about theory of distribution, and there are all sorts of things going on there about what the role of the rentier is. And we live in an economy now where rent extraction is becoming a huge, huge problem. We live in an economy now where financial action is a huge, huge problem. Now that says to me, if we want to really use Marx creatively, we've got to find a way to put the 3 volumes together and look at the totality.
Well, he projected 5 or 6 volumes, right?
Yeah, well, actually, he may have projected 30 volumes.
Right, exactly.
in his fantasy moments, I don't know. But no, I think reading Marx is an inspiration for me. I understand it's not for other people, but I think one of my tasks over the last few years has been to try to produce a way to read Marx which is as available as possible to the mass of the population. And the lectures on Marx's Capital, the companions to Marx's Capital. And I think that there is a critique to be made of leftists in academia. A lot of leftists in academia make Marx much more complicated than he already is, instead of doing what I'm trying to do, which is to sort of simplify without being simplistic. It's a difficult task. But I think I'm not so bad at it, and I think part of the reason I've become so well known is because, you know, if people want to get into Marx, how do they get into Marx? Well, there's the lectures on the web. There's there are the examples of what Marx's analysis does for you, like the book on neoliberalism, for example, was written from a Marxist perspective, and the book on rebel cities was written from a Marxist perspective. So these perspectives are, I think, terribly important and still critical. And in a funny kind of way, Marx is more relevant today than he was before, because when Marx was writing, industrial capital, as sort of analyzes, only existed in Western Europe.
He was just
Britain,
starting to see the beginning of the takeoff,
and
right?
And now we're there. The whole world is like this. And in fact, so Marx is more relevant now than he was back in 1857, 1867.
Well, thank you so much, David. Like you mentioned, David has a website. It's davidharvey.org, right? .org, in which he has many of his lectures up on the website. His books are easily available also on digital versions. You don't have to get the paper sent to you from the United States. And it's been wonderful to have you here at the UNAM. We've touched on lots of issues: Mexican politics, neoliberalism, urbanization, Marxism, China. Fascinating, and please read David Harvey, and hope you come back to
Mexico. And Mexico really has to be the center of a lot of this.
Yes, we're hoping for that Mexico can be a real center for resistance, which can lead to waves throughout the world, and together we can construct a more just planet.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much, David.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Nos vemos en la próxima de Pensadores Contemporáneos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.